majority here so we can get started on the situation cyber awareness. And taking a look at that means, again, we talked about yesterday a little bit, about yourself, about the network, and about the perpetrators in this case. Who are you? Who are the bad guys, and what the networks are? What's your status? Is someone trying to intrude on your system? What's the status of your friends? Or is the network itself at risk in this case? Who are the perpetrators, and what do they really want? And taking a look at General Alexander yesterday again talked about what is normal. That's pretty hard to define. Even looking at the picture, nobody can agree on what the picture, in this case, of a common operating environment really looks like. Those are words we toss around, but each group has its own set of definitions. And how do you see it? You know, how comprehensive do you need to be to attribute? This morning's session will be moderated by Matt Stern. He's the program director, General Dynamics, and he has also been in the field. He's worked at the Land Information Warfare Activity as a senior intelligence officer. He has commanded at battalion level in the field, the 1st IO Battalion, and he has also gone to the field in Iraq with General Metz and the 3rd Corps, becoming the multinational corps there. So again, Matt, turn it over to you. Look forward to a great job here.
Thanks, Bennett. Good morning, everybody. Like Bennett just said, I'm Matt Stern. Try and see around the people on this side of the podium. I've got a really distinguished and expert panel for you today to talk about cyber situational awareness. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panel first, and then we'll dig into the topic at hand and kind of tell you where we're going to focus the panel to try and get, hopefully, some resolution to a couple of the burning questions in cyber around situational awareness, and offer some perspectives not only from the military, the government, but also from industry. So I want to start with the gentleman to my left that I've had the honor and to have served under in my military career. John Davis is the Director of Current Operations for U.S. Cyber Command. Prior to that, he was the Deputy Commander for JTF-GNO. And prior to that, where I served with him was when he commanded 1st IO Command. And 1st IO Command, of course, is the premier IO organization in the military that all others strive to achieve. And there's no bias there. To John's left is Sean McGurk. Sean's currently the director of the NCIC, the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center at DHS. He's got the formidable task of pulling together the cyber situational awareness viewpoint for .gov. Prior to his current role, he was director of the Industrial Control Systems CERT, and he's retired Navy, so I won't hold that against him.
Thank you.
To his left is Mark Sachs. He's the Vice President of National Security Policy for Verizon Communications. He's also retired Army, so there's a theme here. Mm-hmm. He's also a former member of the White House staff, and I think he's very vocal about the cyber situational awareness aspects. I'm looking forward to his comments as well. And then Aaron Walters, down bringing up the end of the panel, the left bookend, if you would, from my perspective. He's the Vice President of Security Research and Development for Terremark and Threat Intelligence. So he's going to also be providing a very technical description of where Terremark's going and their viewpoint from their very unique position in the industry. And we're also going to have Aaron explain a little bit about Terremark because they're a very capable company, and I think they're going to offer a unique perspective. That being said, we're going to move on to what the panel is going to be about. And I'm going to read the description so I get it right. The description is there's a great deal of discussion from achieving situation awareness in cyberspace, but no common definition or understanding of what that means. Terms like know what normal looks like are used but not readily defined, or they're defined in stovepipes but not readily understand across the community. To have this discussion, we feel it would be useful to understand the operational aspects of situational awareness and what will drive the technological solutions. And what does that end state look like? Everybody has a different perspective. So we have the military perspective, we have DHS and the .gov perspective, if you will, and industry's perspective. And like to understand what common ground is going to be is available so that that discussion is more useful. We understand that having the cyber situation awareness is critical to our nation's security today. Understanding where the threat is and where we are so that we don't have fratricide in cyberspace is also a big element. And so what we're hoping to come up with this, the first part of the panel and the first question I'm going to ask the panel, hopefully they will respond, is what does situational awareness mean to you from your perspective? And I'll start with you, sir.
Thanks, Matt. And despite your opening comments, I'm neither distinguished nor an expert, as many old friends in here know, but I am very passionate about this topic, and it's of keen interest to me as the current ops director at Cyber Command. And I don't know exactly what General Alexander said yesterday. I didn't see his remarks, so I hope I'm in line with them, but I'm sure Admiral Glenn, our J6, is taking good notes to make sure that he corrects me if I'm wrong. We've been working very hard within U.S. Cyber Command ever since we stood up last May on the aspect of situational awareness. Like I said, it's my #1 challenge as the current operations director. And we put a lot of thought behind it, and I'll tell you, we're nowhere where we need to be as a military organization in terms of having complete situational awareness in response to our operational needs. But we have put a lot of good thought behind it. We've got some pieces of it in place now, and I think we're moving towards a good path to the future to get us to where we need to be. In terms of where we're headed, we've outlined some effects-based operational requirements that we think are our near-term priorities. And so these are going to drive us, and we always translate it back to our operational requirements to drive where we're headed with situational awareness. And so I'd just briefly, how much time do I have? About 5 minutes? I'll run through them.
Time is you.
I'll run through these pretty quickly, but the idea is we think these are about right, and it'll give you a little bit of insight into the way we're thinking as a military organization about situational awareness. Now, I'll say up front, we may have, our requirements may be a little bit different from other interagency requirements, maybe a little bit different from the commercial sector and the private sector, and I think that's fine. I think there are going to be some distinctions, but I also believe there are some common threads that you're going to find in here because we all share the same infrastructure. 90% of what I use to do military missions across DoD rides on the commercial infrastructure. And so you can't separate this stuff out. It's all interconnected, and so there should be a lot of common threads that run throughout what I need as a military, current ops director in Cyber Command. Should be a lot of common things that you'll see throughout the discussion today. First of all, we think that situational awareness will form the foundation of the DoD Cyber COP, Common Operating Picture, and it should. It should form the basis for that. Second thing is we think it needs to incorporate relevant blue, red, and white or gray information. What do I mean by that? The blue is our own networks, the DoD networks. You could say the .mil, but that's a little bit simplistic for what I'm talking about. But understanding our own networks to the point where we really understand what's critical about those networks. In infantryese, it's key terrain. What the key cyber terrain is, because we know we can't defend everything everywhere. We know we can't, money is going to be an issue as we look forward to the future. You've got to be able to prioritize resources, assets, et cetera. So figuring out where the highest priorities are is going to be key. That's the blue piece. The red piece, obviously, threats. The existing and potential adversary cyber capabilities, as well as it goes beyond cyber. Understanding the threat can include things like Mother Nature. It can include things like accidental human events and equipment failures, et cetera. Those are threats to our networks as well. And then the white or gray, some people say white, some gray. We're talking about everything outside of our wire, outside the blue space, the military, the .mil domain. And that's, as I mentioned earlier, we have so much interconnectivity with the commercial and private sector. That's why it's so key. We don't want to just see a good picture inside of our wire. We want to see what's happening outside so that we can understand in real time what's happening and posture ourselves to be able to defeat or mitigate threats that might be coming our way proactively rather than reacting to it after the fact, after it's something that's already inside and something that we have to deal with. So we think situational awareness requires an understanding of all three, red, blue, and white mission space. Third requirement for us is to focus on both known and emerging threats. Too often, as you might imagine, we focus on what is known, but this environment is so dynamic. You've got to be a step ahead to really do this well. You've got to be a step ahead, and you have to understand where the threats are trending to. What's the next step? You have to be able to outmaneuver cyber adversaries, and they move at a very rapid pace, more rapid than traditional adversaries. And so being able to stay up with that is key to us. It should support alerts and alarms in a published and subscribed model. So just having situational awareness is not good enough. You have to be able to, it has to be meaningful so that you can do something about it. And you need to be able to do something about it very quickly. So the next couple, and I'm just going to run through them very quickly, focus on that. Allowing subordinate organizations to prioritize alerts for their mission space. This isn't just a common operating picture or situational awareness for U.S. Cyber Command. It would be meaningless if it's just us. It has to be something we can distribute down through the architecture within DoD and share with our subordinate organizations across combatant command, services, and agencies. We have to be able to view and analyze data geospatially, logically, and temporally. Geography still matters to us. A lot of people say geography doesn't matter in cyberspace. It does. It matters a great deal with regard to authorities for who can do what. So I think the correct terminology would be geography matters differently in cyberspace than it may matter in the traditional warfighting domains of land, maritime, and air, and space. It has to support near real-time actions and rapid decision-making approaching net speed. The threats, both human and Mother Nature, can occur very rapidly in this battle space as we look at it at Cyber Command. So our decision-making process has to be enabled by situational awareness so that we can rapidly react and make decisions and prioritize assets and resources to deal with what we see. General Alexander probably mentioned the term net speed, and that's where he's driving us, to be able to do this at net speed because many of the cyber threats operate at net speed. So when we're building this situational awareness capability, it's not enough just to get bombarded by data of different types. Embedded in that architecture has to be the ability to quickly analyze that data and separate wheat from chaff so that it's focused on our operational priorities, our cyber key terrain, so that we can make wise decisions in a very rapid manner. We have to initially leverage, and this is our near-term objective, realize there's a lot more work to do in the long term. We've got to leverage our available data sources, and they come from a variety of sensors and capabilities that extend throughout the depth of our defensive layers. We have them at the boundary, at the DoD boundary. We have them at the Tier 2 and Tier 3 level, all the way, at our bases, our camps, our posts, and we have them all the way down to our individual hosts, our devices. We're in the process of fielding that now. So all of those provide data feeds to us that we have to be able to collate, analyze, sort wheat from chaff, and be able to react to. We know that we've got to start with those that are available to us now and include in that what we get from the intelligence community. Like I said, having Cyber Command sitting next to NSA is a great benefit in that aspect. But it's more than the intelligence community. It's Mr. McGurk here at DHS, and seeing and being able to share information rapidly in that gray space that may not be affecting us today, but could be coming our way, and being able to do likewise, share that. It's the same with the commercial and private sector partners. I'll wrap it up here. The last couple are, it's got to support, this situational awareness capability has got to support all three of our lines of operation. In the military, those are your focus of effort. For us, it's directing the operations of our networks, defending our networks, and then leveraging our capabilities to provide offensive options to DoD when authorized, when we have the authorizations to do those kinds of things. The situational awareness capability that we seek has got to account for that spectrum, that all three of those lines of operation. If it's over-focused on any one of them, it's out of balance. And then finally, that's not good enough either. The last piece of this has to do with what I'll call cyber blinders. You can't just be looking at the cyber environment. We can't as a military organization. If we are making decisions without the context of how that's impacting the other domains, the land, maritime, air, and space domains, we'll be making bad decisions. So our situational awareness capability has to incorporate the aspect of what's going on in those other domains, what the combatant commanders and their joint task force commanders and subordinate units, what they're doing operationally in those other traditional domains is very relevant to the decision making that we will be doing in the cyber domain. To do otherwise would be risking putting General Alexander in a position of having to make a decision that has significant negative operational impact to our commanders in the field, and we don't want to do that. So that's a quick outline of what I think is important to us as a military organization and where I think we're heading, at least in the near term.
Thanks. Sean?
I suppose I could start off by saying what John said, and that would surmise much of our focus and concerns in the Department of Homeland Security as well. But before I actually start talking about what situational awareness is, I want to first mention what situational awareness is not. Situational awareness is not information sharing. That's often the terminology that we use to focus on what we're trying to develop. Information sharing does not collaboratively develop knowledge, and that's what we're really trying to do, develop that knowledge base so that we can understand that it's shared, it's coordinated, and it's focused in an operational environment. Much of the challenge that we have in the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center, last time I'm going to say that, from now on it's going to be NCIC, is actually understanding where all those disparate data streams are coming from and then putting those together so that we understand what that common operational picture is. The common operational picture can only be common if it's understood by our partners. And in the NCIC, we have the .gov domain as well as the .com space that we're focusing on trying to develop that. As General Davis mentioned, we are taking an all hazards approach. So it's not just a cyber focus, it's not just a matter of ones and zeros. It could come from a physical domain as well. It could be a kinetic event that has a downstream cyber impact. So we need to look at that and understand what those requirements are as we move forward. In developing that knowledge model, we need then to have the tools to share it at near net speed. Because again, as these effects occur, we need to be able to understand consequences and effects. So in our analysis, we have to understand what the interdependencies of the critical infrastructures are. Much of what we focus on in the NCIC in a day-to-day operational environment is how a particular cyber event may impact one of the 18 critical infrastructure or key resource sectors. Will an event that affects the power system have an impact on the water system? Will that then have an impact in the communications networks? So we look at where those nodes intersect and where do they overlap so that we can then apply the resources to develop the mitigation strategies necessary to address those issues. And we recognize that that's not something that can be done by the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense alone. It needs to be done in coordination with the private sector and across the other departments and agencies, which is why the NCIC has representatives from the private sector physically located on the watch floor. So in our watch environment, we have representatives from the communications sector, from the information technology sector. We're adding additional sectors, both energy and financial, as we move forward. Law enforcement is directly represented so that we understand the picture coming from that arena as well. And in addition, we have embedded intelligence and analysis functions and also our intelligence partners from the other departments and agencies so that we can understand where those threats or vectors may be coming from. By taking all those disparate data streams within our own authorities, whether it's a military authority, whether it's a government authority, whether it's an intelligence authority, and then working with the private sector to understand how it's impacting the states or the various companies, we can start putting together a picture that increases our awareness, and then we can share that in a tier line format so that we get actionable intelligence out to the asset owners and operators. That's really where our primary focus right now is, how to take the classified data that we're receiving on an hourly basis and actually produce information that the private sector can then use to secure and clean up their networks. That's a big challenge that we're focusing on moving forward. We also need to know where our blind spots are. We don't have visibility into all areas, and that's a big challenge also, as General Davis had mentioned. Understanding and knowing what you don't know, and how do you go about getting that information so then you can build that picture is a key function moving forward. And that's why our partnerships with the private sector are so valuable, because they bring that unique perspective. They bring that capability to analyze and understand to the .gov environment so that we can more focus on the mitigations of impacts as opposed to identifying the intrusion sets. And then we need to produce products and information that is both horizontal and vertical. It goes down into the organizations and penetrates to the deck plate, if you will, as well as going across the upper tiers of the agencies and of the commercial and private sectors so that people understand from top to bottom what the issues are and how we can focus our efforts to mitigate those risks. So that's more or less what we're focusing on right now, in addition to our partnership directly with DoD through our mutual, our memorandum of understanding that was signed back in November of this year, of 2010, to actually focus and coordinate our activities between DoD and DHS, and then leverage our continued involvement with the private sector. Thank you.
Mark, your comments?
Thanks, Matt. I'm going to talk a little bit about the communications sector, because that's where Verizon sits, a little bit about Verizon, and then a lot about how we integrate with the federal government and with other sectors. And I hate to use the word information sharing also, as Sean says, but that is so close to what we talk about when we talk about situational awareness. The comms sector, which is made up of not just the classic telephone companies, but the new wireless companies, broadband, broadcasters, et cetera, we're built on top of, if you go back to telegraphs, over 150 years of learning and building. So we've got a global infrastructure now that is milliseconds apart from each other around the planet. So if you think about that from a big picture, the amount of situational awareness for what the planet is doing is overwhelming. I mean, literally, we can see within milliseconds what anybody on the planet is doing if they're using the communications infrastructure to communicate. And by and large, most people are doing that now. There are some isolated pockets of off-the-grid type communications, but we've had such a push in the last 15 to 20 years with the birth of the internet and everything that goes with it, that most everybody now uses part of the global communications infrastructure to communicate. So think about that, what that means from situational awareness, the fact that the information is there because people are talking. How do you get at it? How do you derive from it? Naturally, there are laws and barriers and things that protect us as citizens, but it's there. From a technical perspective, to run a global infrastructure, we have to have situational awareness at the millisecond level. If there's a cable cut, a server outage, BGP routers aren't BGPing or whatever, if the machines can't fix it immediately, humans have to get involved, and humans have to know that there's a problem. If you as a customer, you feel this, if we have an outage someplace, that the time starts clicking, how soon till my whatever comes back up again, which could be from a device to a dial tone to email to wherever you go. So all of us in the comms sector have, just by default over the years, built an incredible capability to technically see our networks. So we all have network operations centers. We integrate them together. They're doing a follow-the-sun model in most cases. Verizon and all of our partners do this, where we are managing the global networks. as a big, large system. So from a technical perspective, the situational awareness, I think we've got that about as good as state-of-the-art's going to get it. Always room for improvement, but we're always learning as things change. The challenge, though, is how do we integrate what we know about our networks, what we could know about the people using the networks, with what our partners over in the federal government and other governments, to be fair, because this is a global thing, it's not just the United States. How do we package that all together so we can build this common view? The challenge there then lies in that word that we don't like to talk about, which is information sharing. I can't legally pass over to DHS all the technical information about my network. A lot of reasons that we don't want to do that, a lot of reasons that DHS doesn't want to know all that information either. But there are requirements. For example, if we have a cable outage, the FCC has a requirement. We have to report it within a certain amount of time that has to be reported to the government. Others in other sectors have that same reporting requirement. So we do have that type of interface, but there's so much more that we could look at. Another challenge that we face is, think about all of us as humans. What do we talk about? How do you develop your own situational awareness? If you're a parent, you have kids. If your kids are on Facebook, are you their friend, and do you use that as situational awareness for your children? And many of us do. We don't even think about the fact that we do that, is to find out where somebody is. If you're on Facebook or Twitter or any of these new emerging social networking sites, you might actually look there first. If we're not doing it, the generation behind us is absolutely doing it. So some of this situational problem that we're trying to solve is actually being solved by society through these new social networking tools. And maybe there's some insights there as to how we could derive from that some of the challenges that DHS and DOD and others are trying to meet in terms of learning about the enemy, learning about the gray zone, learning about what else is going on. Just look at what people and organizations say about themselves and amongst themselves using the global communications infrastructure. Groups are very willing to talk about themselves, advertise what they're doing, and this goes back to good old intelligence gathering. How do you derive from that the common knowledge? Last thing I want to mention is we often have talked about a common operating picture. This nirvana of everybody sees the same thing goes back decades, as we're all aware. There's been lots of solutions that have been offered so that we can present, you got the visualization, the big NASA-style screens where you can see everything in one place, and we have complete visualization of what's going on. For anybody who's tried to do that, you know that there's an incredible amount of barriers to overcome, and we sometimes have to ask the question, is it even possible for everybody to have the same picture, a common picture? And the answer is probably no, because we all look at the problem from different angles. And maybe is it better that we all do have slightly different views, what I might call the uncommon picture? Because if you have a slightly different view of the same situation, you'll come up with slightly different approaches for how to solve that problem. If you're then integrating those slightly different approaches, that might synthesize a far better final approach to solving the problem versus everybody sees the same thing, everybody comes up with the same answer, and it turns out that answer is not really diverse. So diversity in terms of views may be very good, as well as diversity in terms of all the other things that we do. Just something to think about as we continue to move forward with the common operating picture ideas.
All right, so my goal as being a part of this panel is to kind of offer a different perspective. And almost what Marcus kind of said, that common operating picture. From our perspective, what is that common operating picture from a service provider, right? So it's not going to be the same for everyone else. And to give you some context, Terremark is a leading provider of IT services. And what we found is that we were starting to host a lot of critical infrastructure, right? For the government, for commercial, for a lot of different organizations. So from that perspective, we had to kind of change our security posture, right? So we had to be more adaptive and more proactive in the sense that now we're hosting these critical systems. So instead of the static nature of what the information had been before, we needed to be able to adapt to these different threats that could be offered by different groups. And in order for us to do that, part of that was to achieve improve that situational awareness. And for us, what does it mean? As other people have kind of mentioned, it relates to visibility. We had to have the visibility to look into our infrastructure to see what was actually happening. We also had to have contextual comprehension, right? So no matter what we see, we had to put it in the context of our business or the greater picture of what the organization was. And then finally, we had to be able to take those artifacts and then be able to, use those to facilitate a timely and an effective response? How can we take the data that we're receiving, and in order to generate activity and responses to whatever the activity that could be happening, whatever those cyber situations may be. And for us, this kind of fits into a larger perspective and a larger philosophy of how we do information assurance. Part of that is this notion of what we call intrusion suppression. And what this comes down to is the fact that the threat groups that are targeting our organizations, no matter what, if they're motivated enough, they're going to be able to find a way in, right? There's always going to be people. There's always going to be, the systems that we're using are very complex. And so in order to kind of deal with that, we have to build a model that allows us to minimize the impact of the damage they could potentially cause to us, and then also to be able to leverage whatever unknown, whatever thing that they're leveraging, whatever aspect of the unknown to target us, and that they're taking advantage, whatever opaque component of our awareness that they're using, how can we leverage that as quick as possible to then spread that, throughout the organization, to spread that with our partners in order to improve that awareness overall. And so for us, we realized that we had to focus two places. One, we had to focus internally within our organization, and we had to look out to the internet, right, to see what was going on. So for us, we had to make sure that anywhere we had opaqueness, whether it was in our network infrastructure, whether it was our host visibility, we had to increase that. And then we also had to look for the internet community, right, to see how the threats were targeting other people, to see what was going on in those organizations. And then we also had to look, almost as was mentioned earlier, into that red component. What were the attackers doing? Why would they target us? And so from our standpoint, we kind of focused, we tried to extend our normal security operations. So most places out, organizations in the commercial land have a SOC, right? This is the goal of this SOC, is to protect your infrastructure. Unfortunately, oftentimes, you're relying explicitly on alerts. You're waiting for things to happen, or you're depending on your commercials, say your antivirus vendors, in order to support you, right, to provide that threat intelligence that you're looking for. What we realized was the threats that were targeting everyone else weren't necessarily the ones that were targeting us in particular, right? So we had to build the resources in-house to be able to do that. The second was timeliness. If we had to wait for your typical commercial vendor to get you that information in a short amount of time, you were not going to be able to deal with the threat at the pace that you needed to be. So for us, we tried to develop groups within the organization and the whole goal was to increase the collective situational awareness. The first part is we have explicit group, which is focused on understanding the internals of our organizations. Their task is to understand the network operations, to understand what the system looks like when it's functioning the way it's supposed to be, right? That's that internal, that introspection component. What we also decided to do is create an engagement services group. And what this was designed to do is to work with other people in industry and help them in their investigations. So we go out into other companies, into the DIB, into the military, et cetera, and help them work their investigations. How does this help us? This gives us a proactive stance with our security, because now we can see what the threats are doing in everyone else's environments before they come to my environment, right? So this gives me a very unique perspective. And then third, we started a group, which is my group, which is threat intelligence. So our group is in charge of tracking the different threat groups around the world. And it comes from a different vantage point, right, from the government. We're not really focused on what they're doing from the government perspective. We're focusing on how that could affect us. So you do have these different vantage points. And what we actually do, we've decided to be very, very proactive. So we engage everyone, work very closely with the government. We work very closely with other service providers who have a unique perspective. We work very closely with other incident response companies. We work very closely with all these different organizations, and the goal for us is to improve our model of what's actually happening on the internet. So that kind of gives us those two perspectives, right? So focus internally to understand better what's happening in our own infrastructure, and to look externally to see what's happening to our neighbor, and then to understand what the attackers are doing as well. So the advantages with this is, from another perspective, Terremark has a kind of a unique position in the sense that we have a lot of different customers. So we have the bankings, we have the financials, we have different governments, we have different parts of both civilian and federal government. The interesting nature of that is we can see attacks as they start to evolve over time. So we see an attack in your organization. Later we see them, as a specific example, we see an unknown piece of malware, an unknown distribution mechanism being used in a financial organization. It's not working effectively, but we can see the attackers what they're attempting to do. Later we see that migrate into the government organizations. So now we can actually see that activity, and then we can use that to tip and cue, say, our government customers, et cetera. So how do we leverage that vantage point and share that information? And so that's been a big part of what we've been doing now because, as I'm sure Marcus is aware, different types of indicators we have different longevity, right? Like it's only useful for a certain amount of time. And so if you can only spread that information within that time window, that's the only way you're going to be able to effectively make use of that. So that's kind of a part of it. And I think another major component for us is we have a big challenge with is how do we interact with the government in general? So the hardest person for us to share with overall has been the government. So we have a lot of sharing partnerships with other service providers. We have a lot of partnerships with other commercial entities. One of the challenges we have to government is what type of information they would find useful, the best mechanisms that we can give them that information, what information that they are allowed to accept from us, and then that it gets extended is to how does that become a bi-directional partnership, right? How does that help us? So we can give you all kinds of useful stuff based on our visibility, based on the granularity of our perspective, kind of that uncommon operating picture, but how can you make most use of it, and how is that going to facilitate us to further protect our infrastructure? Thank you.
Well, I think we've discussed a lot, and there's definitely some common themes and messages that are coming across. One of the things, since we've got this time to talk about, is to talk about the kind of from each perspectives, the lowest, if you will, common denominator, or the common ground, or maybe the start point to develop the trust, confidence, or whatever from the different lanes you perceive as the things where we could start to gain the situation awareness, whether it's gray information, blue information, or red information. What are the probably top 3 things that you each would need to move forward to gain this the ultimate objective of situational awareness from your perspective? Anybody, or we can go down the line. You want to say?
I can start if you want me to, or go ahead, sir.
Go ahead, Marcus.
All right, I'll take the first bite at the apple. Oftentimes when we try and share things, we can't share the specific information because it's illegal, or it's company proprietary, or the data belongs to somebody else. But yet there's rich information that needs to be shared. I'll get real granular. We've got a packet flow coming at a customer, and we know that what's inside that packet flow contains malware. We would like to be able to tell our partners, our own customers, DHS, whatever, that the malware exists and it is targeting a customer. That's rich information. That's something that everybody kind of needs to know about. But oftentimes we get so bound into who does it really belong to once it gets into the customer's network, and can we really derive that as a carrier? And then we have to, abide by the ECPA rules and all the things that protect our privacy. How much can we extract out? So oftentimes we get so quagmired into what's the actual information that's important to everybody, and what's the extra stuff that's proprietary that we can strip off. So that's one of our challenges, is how do we build, say, a sensor grid that can anonymize the part that's private while preserving the part that has rich, timely, millisecond-oriented information that we can share amongst ourselves. So that's a big challenge there. And there is some academic work being done, but I don't think we have a good solution for this one yet, at least one that all the lawyers agree to that will allow us to provide that type of feed. A second one, though, that we've made a lot of headway on is after the fact, forensics. So if we're investigating a data breach, for example, Verizon's done a lot of work in this. Let me just speak about it for a second. Large data breaches where credit cards, millions of personally identifiable things are stolen. We can go in and analyze it almost like an NTSB investigation of an airline crash, and we can pull out of it elements of information that can be compared across other data breaches and begin to find a lot of commonality. Again, we can anonymize who was broken into. We can anonymize the data that was actually stolen, but we start focusing in on what's the causes of what continues to repeat itself. That's very rich information. We're already partnering with the Secret Service. We're working with the FBI, working with inside of DHS and others to build a framework now for that type of sharing of data. It's not real time. This is after the fact. but it's a huge leap forward in terms of the situational awareness that surrounds what mistakes are commonly being repeated and how do we get that information out to everybody, particularly within the government, so that we don't continue making those mistakes that we know are being leveraged by our adversaries. So that we're showing a lot of fruit there, and perhaps that model, that framework that we're developing for forensics might be applicable to real-time information gathering, scrubbing, and sharing amongst us.
Thanks, Mark. Anybody else?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I agree with what Marcus said, and I would add a couple of things that might be some low-hanging fruit, so to speak. We all have a great need for the analysis of data at more rapid speeds. And what I think each of us are asking for is not to be overloaded in information, making it more difficult to understand what's critical in rapid fashion to enable wise decision-making. So I think one of the common platforms is the ability to do good analysis of tremendous amounts of data very quickly to help us sort wheat from chaff, like I mentioned before. I think that's a common thread that we would all benefit from. None of us have the capacity, and few of us have even the amount of skill sets that we need to do all this very effectively. So any way we can use technology to help with that, I think would be a benefit. Talking about capacity, I think there's a common thread, and maybe this was kind of a tangential issue, but you know, there's a finite amount of human capital associated with the skill sets required to be able to do this job. Mm-hmm. And so one of the key components in situational awareness is the people who are going to be sorting through all of this data. I think a common thread is the need, and this spans across government and the private sector, is the need for training and education and the amount of skill sets required to do this job effectively. We all need it. We all kind of rob from each other. The same small pool set of people that are trying to find the best job in this business are high-value commodities. We need to grow the workforce. We all need to be able to leverage that workforce, and I think technology might help us to be able to do more with fewer trained, skilled people. And then finally, also maybe a tangential issue, but just understanding each other's processes goes a long way to helping. We've got a great relationship with DHS. We hold some of our own people hostages from each other. We have an element at Cybercom and at NSA from DHS now. We have elements there. So exchanging those liaison capabilities to better understand the processes between organizations, I think, helps for us to understand processes, technological challenges, legal hurdles and issues that have to be overcome, and might enable us to find solutions much more effectively and efficiently than we have in the past. We've started doing that. I don't think it's as robust as any of us need it. That, of course, also requires capacity to be able to do that. And so I think all three of those issues that I mentioned are kind of tied together in some form.
And if I can, I'd just like to expand on that a little bit, because absolutely in agreement with both Marcus and John's comments about what we're looking at and the mutual benefit that needs to be derived as a result of this activity. One of the things that we try to do, and I think industry actually does it best, is understand the difference between digital media analysis and forensics. When you're dealing with forensics, you're trying to derive a long-term product. When you're talking about digital media analysis in a SOC, you're talking about immediate actions to prevent further exposure of a problem or exposure of your networks. So instead of delving into the analytics to the point where we're deriving forensic products, we need, from an operational standpoint, to look at better digital media analysis techniques and capabilities, and then building that strong set of individuals that are able to execute that mission. Secondly, I think understanding and at least speaking the same language when it comes to common vulnerability analysis. Many of the government programs, as well as the private sector, actually conduct vulnerability analysis of products and systems and field devices to determine what those impacts are. But often we don't have a central repository of vulnerabilities, and we either duplicate effort or we actually prevent a security aspect from being realized because we're implementing a product in a certain way that actually enhances a vulnerability as opposed to mitigating vulnerabilities. So that would also allow us to share that information openly and then also understand what the impacts are of integrating those products. And then for the government especially is knowing when to off-ramp information. And by that I mean a day doesn't go by where a report comes into the NCIC watch floor that the analysts would love to own and take on and actually execute and conduct research on, but it's really not in our focused mission space right now. So knowing when to let it go and off-ramping it with all of the applicable background information to whichever partner is best suited and best prepared to execute on it, I think is key. We can't own everything and we can't be responsible for everything. We need to coordinate that activity across several of our partners. So knowing when to take it in and then off-ramp it, I think is a key. And I think it's a mutual benefit for all of us to understand the necessity in doing that. So those are kind of the three top things that I look at as we continue to move forward.
Well, briefly, I think I agree with you. The communication mechanism is a big part of that, right? Having the ability, so I don't have to have the same conversation with 3 different areas of the armed forces to relay the information necessary, that's always a major challenge that we face. The other one I agree with you as well is the expectations, right? Setting those expectations of what type of information you would want and what you would expect back from us. Like, for example, if you did off-ramp that to someone else to be able to do the analysis, what they can give back to you and how that will be most useful. And I think the last part of it is trust, right? For us is what organizations we work with. Unfortunately, at this point, the majority of the information sharing happens because of trust relationships, right? Like, and that's always the most challenging component. We share particularly with, say, certain areas of the armed forces because we trust them that much better. We have that much better of a relationship with them, so they get a lot more information from us as well.
You know, that's an unfortunate phenomenon that's happened over the last many years. Is situational awareness is driven by interpersonal communications. So people find other people that they trust, and if something bad is happening, the alert goes out amongst the trusted group. It doesn't necessarily go out through official channels. And then the officials get all hot and bothered because they haven't been notified. And it seems like everybody below me knows what's going on, but nobody's telling me. That's a political problem we're going to have to deal with, but it's a reality, particularly as we get more and more hyper-connected with our little friendship groups and Twitter groups and Facebook groups and everybody else that has great situational awareness of your group, but it doesn't translate up to the senior officials who need to make real-time decisions because they're just not seeing what everybody else is talking about because they just don't happen to be part of that group. That may actually, this social networking stuff may worsen the situation rather than making it better, but I still think we can leverage a lot of those tools in terms of raising our own situational awareness of what's going on.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think, interestingly enough, the comments that you made, General Davis, about the fact that this is a very small, commoditized community, and you know, everybody in this community, a lot of us have grown up together. We get to know each other, and you trust people you know, and so a lot of that information is shared, especially when you get into, for instance, the malware analysis aspects of this. That's a community in and of itself. Mm-hmm. So I guess the next thing is, I'm going to ask, this is going to be my first not softball. This is going to be a little bit of a hardball. So how do we institutionalize trust? If this is all based on relationships, what do we have to do as a community to kind of get past the idea that it's based on trust relationships, and how do we institutionalize the trust, and what mechanisms can we possibly put in place so that we can, you know, have these conversations or share certain pieces of information to create a common ground and understanding?
I'll take a stab at it. I don't have the answer, but I think urgency is one of the things that's going to get us through this. I'm sure General Alexander yesterday talked to you about what keeps him up at night, and the fact that what we're watching over the course of the last decade or so in this environment has taken us from, you know, an environment where the primary threat was stealing information on the networks. And then in the Estonia and the Georgia case, we saw disruptive efforts timed to coincide with military action, traditional military force. And that now what we're seeing is evidence of destructive capabilities that are being built and cause us great concern. We need to figure this out. We need to figure it out quickly, because if we don't, we're going to be forced into a situation where we're reacting to it. So I don't know that I have the answer to what's going to cause that to happen. I hope it isn't a major incident of national significance that causes us to to break down some of these hurdles that we currently are living with. I'm very hopeful we can do that by working together in advance of a situation like that. But I do think if we don't, that situation's coming, and it's coming probably faster than we think it is.
Anyone else?
I also believe that, as the General had mentioned, that we have seen the evolution of the threat landscape from focusing on data exfiltration to actually modifying the settings of the physical pieces of equipment to control our daily lives. So when you look at not just accessing information on a network, but controlling the networks that control the physical processes, we have a completely different focus and a different exchange of information. From the department's standpoint, since the vast majority of the critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector, one of our clear paths forward is continuing to engage and develop our public-private partnership. And the only way we can do that is to put mechanisms in place that protect that information from disclosure, from regulatory authorities, from whatever is necessary to ensure that we can have an open, free flow of data, so that when an incident response or incident management team is working with an asset owner, that they're assured that their data will not be compromised, that the information associated with their processes that may be proprietary are being secured and controlled, so it's not going to be released to the public. Those types of things are areas that we continue to focus on, given the authorities that the department currently executes under its protection of critical infrastructure information. So these are a few steps that we can use to move forward to develop that trust, but it has to be of mutual benefit. And I keep going back to that phrase, because the asset owners and operators have to recognize that when they're dealing with the department, they're dealing with a trusted agent that is not going to release that information, that is not going to allow that information to fall into the wrong hands, so that we can actually provide value to that company. And then also, we have to have that trust coming back to the department that when an incident occurs or an event occurs, that our partners are going to be open and forthcoming and sharing that information with us, so that we then can take the necessary steps to not only secure that one company, but to secure that critical infrastructure that that company represents. So that's part of the challenge moving forward, but we are starting to develop those frameworks, both under the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative and also through other public-private partnerships.
The fact that something's happening, the situation that we want to be aware of, is always known, at least to those who are conducting the situation, and oftentimes is known by others who happen to be observing it but don't know that they're observing it. You talk about having a seminal moment. We've had two of these in the last 10 years, the obvious one being September 11th, where lots of people saw the pieces, but nobody was able to tie it together and sound the alarm that something bad was about to happen. We just saw it unfold in front of us. Part of the reaction to that, of course, was while we do need to do a better job, we need to get different parts of government talking to each other, industry and others, we need to set up more sharing, more access. It slapped us in the face last summer with an event known as the WikiLeaks episode, where because of all the increased information sharing, now we've got people that have access to information that they probably don't need to have access to, and begin to make that publicly known to everybody. So now most of the world has full situational awareness over what State Department cables look like and the content of those cables. So we're reacting to that. And we'll continue, I'm afraid, to bounce back and forth between who needs to know about a situation and who doesn't need to know about a situation, and where's that middle ground. And unfortunately, every time we begin to find that middle ground, something new is going to happen that will cause us to react again. So I don't think we'll ever get to answer your hard question. How do we do this? Well, the answer is going to change every year. As the technologies change, as the threats change, as we better understand how we're communicating and thinking amongst ourselves. So it's almost, I hate to say it's an endless journey, but that is sort of what we're on. And the best we can do is to be aware that it's like that and that we've got some guideposts that we're aiming towards and just continue working towards that. Don't give up, but don't expect that a day will come that will say, okay, we're done. Now we have perfect situational awareness. I think we're misleading ourselves if we feel we'll ever get to that point because of technology, because of society, and other factors that will prevent us from getting there.
So from my perspective, I don't think we can ever institutionalize the trust necessary to make situational awareness. Unfortunately, as many of you are aware, it becomes you build trust, right? Like it's your camaraderie, the people that you work with, and unfortunately, it's manifested itself in our current world through crisis, right? So you have September 11th, something bad happens, we have to work together, and that kind of forces the issue. So until we have to find those mechanisms by which we can kind of foster that, that collaboration, that notion of us working together before the crisis hits. And you actually see this, I come from kind of more the open source community and the sharing community. It comes because everybody's offering something up. They have something to lose. If you are not part of that community, you're basically, voted off the island, right? You're no longer part of what is actually happening. And so you have to foster that. And I think some of the current programs with respect to taking people from industry and from government and almost doing short-term internships, like I heard spoke at RSA last week, I think that's something that can help work to that, right? So you can build those relationships, have them stronger, so when they're in place, okay, it's because I'm friends with you, we've worked together, that expands into your organization. And I think in order to affect situational awareness, you kind of have to build that and foster those relationships ahead of time.
You're familiar, many of you are probably familiar with the National Security Information Exchange, the NSIE. 20-year-old organization started within the federal government, used by the private sector to share information with the government there. It's not real time. This happens every other month they get together, but it's built an incredible trust relationship between industry and government to share big pieces of information. But as you say, if you're allowed to come to one meeting and not bring anything, just kind of as a test, but the next time you come, if you don't have something to lay on the table to share with others, you're not invited back. So that building of trust, the bona fides there is that you are willing to share something that's confidential to you. You're willing to open up and expose that to others. You build that trust environment. In the critical infrastructures, a number of years ago, British Columbia tried an experiment. This is British Columbia Institute of Technology. Could we get critical infrastructure asset owners? This would be like power grid, things like that. If you have an incident, put it into a database so other people could learn about the incident. But to look at the database, you had to already have submitted something to it. So the trust mechanism says I'm willing to share, and if I'm willing to share, then I'm allowed to look at what everybody else has. It's not a voyeuristic mindset, which is what most everybody goes into. I want to see everything you're doing, but I'm not going to tell you a dang thing about what's going on in my world. That's not how we get to this common picture or to this situational awareness that we want. So part of that trust breakdown may be each of us being able to open up a little more and show a little, offering of what we're doing so that others may then develop their trust in us that we're willing to share as well. Legally, got to always put that legal thing in there.
Okay, I think those are all great comments, like my opinion matters, but what we want to do now is open it up for a little while for questions from the general audience. So there's a couple microphones situated on the floor, so if anybody has any questions, and then we'll go back and do a wrap-up. So please.
Maybe agree or disagree that when we talk about these situations, we borrow heavily from the physical world, strategy, tactics, terminology. Can't hear you. What I was saying is, we borrow heavily from the physical world, I would say, in terms of strategy, tactics, terminology, in describing what's going on. Maybe you would comment on, is that adequate? Are our adversaries simply taking strategy and tactics from the physical world and using cyberspace as just another tool? Or are we going to have to morph our thinking about strategy and tactics into brand new ways and are we deficient in the ability to come up with new ways of looking at things?
I'll take a stab at that. I'm not sure I have the answer, but I do agree with your premise, and I do think terminology is a very complicated issue in this environment. I'm an infantry guy that came into this line of business and not an IT expert. And I got to tell you, my first series of experiences, I had all this technical information coming at me, and I couldn't make any sense out of it. So I had to put it into a framework that I could understand. I had a lot of help being able to do that, and but the problem was I began to put it into that framework and use analogies, and those analogies didn't always hold up. The cyber domain is different. It is. And so you got to be real careful. And I know the Defense Department is working on the terminology problem right now, because we want to make cyber, we want commanders to own, take ownership in this issue. Because once commanders do it, it becomes a priority for commanders, everything else flows. People pay attention to it, resources and capabilities get built, inspections are meaningful, compliance is something that follows suit. You want commanders, traditional commanders, to take ownership of this in the military. And so you try to put, when in describing critical events that are going on in the cyber domain, we try to put it in the flavor that traditional commanders can understand. And when you use standard terminology, standard traditional terminology, you can get yourself in a lot of trouble because those analogies don't always hold up. And you could be enabling bad decision making if you're not careful. So I do think we need to find a middle ground that recognizes that tries to leverage, at least from the military perspective. I mean, this may not pertain as much to my friends on the panel, but it does to us. We have to make this meaningful for commanders, an older generation of commanders who may not have grown up with the way our younger generation has. And we have to use terminology that operational terminology that is meaningful to them, yet we can't cross that line and go into false analogies. So we need to be very careful with it and find the right blend between the technical and the traditional, at least as the next step to get us forward. Because otherwise, our leaders won't understand what the heck you're talking about. Like my first experience in this environment. It took me a while to learn it. That's why education and training is so important. I don't think there are any easy fixes to this, but I know at least from the military perspective, we're working that. And it's a very complicated issue.
I'd also like to add, I'd like to address your, the second part of your question where you were talking about, is cyber just an extension of kinetic, or is it something that we need to change our philosophy and how it's being approached? I agree that we often try to use real-world terminology to describe the virtual world. And in the past, what we've seen, the exploits coming from some of the malicious activity mirrored physical world activity. But that was now-generation operators executing under now-generation thought patterns and processes. Future generation and next generation that are actually executing cyber are not using the same constraints that they learned from us. So they're approaching it in a completely different way. Classically, as an engineer, I would think about not when something was designed to operate, what were its design parameters, what it was designed to do, and then I would ensure that it met the mission requirements. The current generation is looking at not what it was designed to do, but what can I do with it? And now that I can do something with it, how can I do more with it? So they're taking a completely different focus. So our traditional physical worldview to cyber is not directly applicable and will not sustain the future. We need to address, and that is going back to the education piece, recognizing that the way we're approaching cyber needs to be fundamentally different than the way we're approaching physical.
Let me disagree just slightly. Human minds and human thinking really haven't changed. We're still humans. We still compete. We still want to have things we can't have. The social sciences will tell us that. But the difference, which I think is what's causing us to pull back from this, is cyberspace is a different animal. This millisecond connectivity globally is something we've never had before. We've never been able to connect human minds so that you may have two people that have the same objective, the same social objectives, but now they can communicate about it, which they couldn't do before. That's what's different. So what Sean's saying is correct about the current generation in terms of their thinking pre-internet, kinetic world. New generations will think new, but I think that what they're looking at is not a new way of harassing or abusing us, but the fact that their minds can get together in milliseconds, that they can talk about it, that they can develop approaches and strategies, they can communicate in encrypted means that we can't watch. Those are the rules that have changed, and that's what we need to start thinking about is how are our adversaries working in a world where they can communicate almost instantly and anonymously. On the good side, can we do the same thing? Can we leverage those same technologies to communicate almost instantly and in a collaborative fashion? And so we stay on pace with what our adversaries are doing, using those same technologies that they're using against us. We use that to help with our understanding of what's going on. So stop thinking kinetically like it takes 18 minutes for an ICBM to go over the poles. It takes less than 18 milliseconds for something launched on one side of the planet to completely destroy something on the other side of the planet. So those time scales are different. That's what we have to internalize in terms of our response and our understanding of it.
So I agree with Marcus that the strategies we see are similarity, right? At the high level, what they want to do, how they want to accomplish, disruption, exfil, these types of things, right? What we see as I agree, is there are differences, like who are they? Where are they, right? These are hard questions that answer on the internet, right? You have large groups that can, have these meetups or arbitrary collections at some point and do some type of activity and then they disperse again. How do we deal with that? So I think those aspects make it very different from our traditional response and how we look at the problem. And I agree with Marcus, it's a communication issue as well, right? So they're evolving that quickly, that rapidness, All of a sudden, out of nowhere, you had a social group that formed and decided they were going to go after a specific target. And because we don't have good attribution, how do you target them? How do you know who they were? How do you go back? What's the cost for them to actually put that group together and have that threat? So those issues make it very different. So I think from a strategy perspective, I think we have a lot of similarities, but from the mechanisms and from the evolving and adaptivity, we have to be able to kind of change our mechanisms to address that as well.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Kisses before the
I got
question.
to see my friends. How are you? I'm Jamie Dos Santos, and I want to ask both General Davis and Mr. McGurk a question, and I want to add one other comment. I'm not sure if everybody is aware of what Aaron Walters was talking about. What he sits on are internet exchanges all over the world. So, for example, in one place in Miami, there's 172 networks. So that's the type of information that he's trying to describe. So the questions are, General Davis, I'll start with you. If we have this information, right? Terremark has malware across domains, .gov, .com, .mil. And so if we came to you as Cybercom or DHS, would you all be able to tell us what information you could use from us? Could you describe what you would need from us?
I think I could. I mean, the method that we use from a current operations perspective is called a threat mitigation framework. And it enables us to take a series of what we see day to day, what we deal with day to day, and those things that by our assessment are having the greatest operational impact on DoD being able to perform its main missions, and those kind of congeal into some categories of vulnerabilities and categories of threat activity that kind of are our top 5, 6, 7 vulnerabilities, categories of top threat activities. And those major categories form the basis of our priorities that enable us to focus action and devote resources and time and attention to those things that we think are most important. So we know, and now this is not a static framework, it's a very dynamic framework. It changes, our process is we review this formally on a weekly basis, but something can pop up in real time and cause that prioritization to change. But I'm able to go through that, and I'm able to name the top vulnerabilities that we're dealing with on any categories of vulnerabilities on any given day, and the top threat activities that I'm dealing with. And I think from that framework, we reach out to a number of organizations in the intelligence community, the commercial sector, and our partner organizations. DHS is just one of them. FBI is another with NCI-JTF. Through the Defense Cyber Crime Center, we reach out to those commercial entities who are most closely related to, the defense industry, defense industrial base, those who have partnered with us. Wide variety of organizations that we reach out to find out if there's any information related to those top vulnerabilities or top threat activities. So I think the answer is yes. We can focus our effort on what we need help with the most from our perspective.
No, I appreciate it. And Mr. McGurk, the same question. Do you all have basically identified what, as the private sector, how they would share that information with you?
Yes, and much of the process that we follow is the same as General Davis' process. The department focuses on the risk equation, which we define as threat, vulnerability, and consequence. So we may not necessarily be developing the threat piece. We get that from external sources and our partners in the intelligence community. But the vulnerability and the consequence is what we're really focusing on, and that would help drive that understanding of consequence and effect. Because we need to look at what mitigation plans are necessary to prevent a cascading impact across the energy sector, the water sector, the financial sector. So that type of information coming in and those types of feeds will help us better clarify and understand that risk model, so then we can then focus on the vulnerabilities and the consequences. Yeah. So I believe without a doubt that would be beneficial information. No,
I appreciate it, and I know we're trying to wrap up here. So how do you choose who you're going to accept information from or who you're going to reach out to? The only reason that I say this is that, as you can imagine, what we and who we talk to all the time, we've reached out to your organizations and not been able to pull the relationship together. So,
well, I don't have a lawyer sitting here with me right now, but what I would like to do is that our focused approach is being inclusive within the guidelines as opposed to exclusive. For instance, in bringing our private sector partners on board and into the NCIC, what we found was that in trying to execute a single agreement between each of the sectors, that's not possible.
Forget it.
So we have to enter into individual agreements with various elements. So what we negotiated with the IT sector is fundamentally different than what we negotiated with the comm sector or the financial services or the energy sector. So that's a challenge moving forward. So we recognize that, and I'm willing and standing by to work through those issues so that we can develop those partnerships. But my goal would be to be inclusive of all data streams so that we can better understand what the challenges are.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry it went so long, but I think there's quite a few people here that needed to hear that answer, so thanks.
Absolutely.
So to wrap up, and thanks, Jamie, to wrap up, I'd just like to leave with, when you come to one of these sessions, you like to come away with something that you've learned, and I'm going to give you what I learned sitting on the panel, and that is, I'm going to surmise situational awareness as visibility and contextual comprehension in order to facilitate timely and effective response as a start point to lend some common ground and common terminology for future discussions. So with that, I think I'd like to thank the panel, and I think Bennett's up here to...
Thank you very much, panel. These are our silent heroes, and they work in a silent world. It's very much unheeded, and we've got the hero little booklet for each one of them. Again, thank you.